Welcome, everybody, and good afternoon. My name is Emily Bell, and I'm the Communications Coordinator for the Florida Wildflower Foundation. Thank you for joining us today for our webinar, Future Directions of the Million Orchid Project, Potential for New Natural Experiments. We'd love for you to say hi and in the chat and let us know where you're joining us from. For those of you who are not familiar with our organization, our mission is to protect, connect, and expand native wildflower habitats through our education, research, planting, and conservation programs. Our work is made possible primarily through the sales and renewals of the Florida State Wildflower License Plate. These funds, along with donations and memberships, allow us to support and create projects that build awareness and knowledge of native wildflowers and plants throughout Florida. And this year, we're very excited to be celebrating 25 years of the plate being on the road. We'd like to encourage those of you who find our programs valuable to consider becoming a member, making a donation, or purchasing the State Wildflower License Plate. If you purchase or have the plate, you're eligible for membership. Just let us know you have the tag and we'll get you set up in our database. Be sure to check out our website for resources on planting and growing wildflowers, to learn where to see wildflowers in bloom, for upcoming events and more. We're also on social media, and you can find us on most platforms at FLA Wildflowers. We've got a bunch of great events coming up. Our next webinar on August 20th, you'll be with me, and we'll be talking about bringing on the butterflies, how your gardening practices can attract and support a wide diversity of butterflies. Also, stay tuned for many great field trips coming up. Our next field trip to Deep Creek in Putnam County this Saturday is sold out, but we're looking forward to joining up with the Nature Conservancy and Florida Native Plant Society in our September trip to TNC's private Rock Hill Preserve. And then we'll be with Dr. Jim Folsom at St. George Island State Park on Saturday, October 25th. So if you want to get early registration opportunities for these and other events, be sure to sign up as a foundation member. And then also just follow along on social media, subscribe to our newsletter, and check out flawildflowers.org/events to keep up with everything we've got going on. Just a few housekeeping items before we get started. All attendees are muted with cameras off. Please submit any questions through the Q&A feature. The chat is active, but we do not monitor it for questions, so you have to use the Q&A. We'll address questions at the end of the talk as time permits, but if your question isn't answered, you can email it to us at info@flawildflowers.org. This webinar is being recorded and will be available on our website and YouTube channel in 24 to 48 hours. When it is available, you'll receive an email from us with a link to the recording, along with a resource page with links from the webinar. Now, I would like to introduce our speaker. Originally from Kansas City, Jason earned a BS in biology from the University of Kansas. After graduation, he relocated to Miami to start his graduate studies at the University of Miami, working as assistant to the curator for the Gifford Arboretum. He completed his MS in environmental science and a PhD in biology at Florida International University. During his graduate tenure, he held positions at Fairchild Garden and the Smithsonian Environmental Research Center, working on research related to orchid ecology, mycorrhizal genetics, and conservation. He has worked in orchid conservation in Florida, China, Southeast Asia, and the Caribbean for over 10 years. Jason is currently the Director of Research at Fairchild Garden, where he focuses on orchid research, propagation, education, and conservation. The Million Orchid Project is an internationally recognized community science program and the largest public outreach program focused on orchids in the world. With over 40,000 K-12 and undergraduate students participating, more than 600,000 native orchids have been replanted into public landscapes in South Florida. This conservation and research has been published in peer-reviewed journals and publicized through many media outlets. With that, I will hand it over to Dr. Downing, and just say thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for that beautiful introduction, and it's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to share my screen with you guys. One 1 second. All right, There we go. All right. Well, hopefully everyone can see that. And well, again, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure always to reach out to different parts of our state of Florida and different communities that may not have heard about the Million Orchid Project, and also begin to um, uh, have strategies on ways to increase our outputs, and that's by cooperations, collaborations, and community engagement, as you'll see. So the Million Orchid Project, a little background on that, as the name implies, it's this really ambitious effort to reestablish, I call repatriate, 1 million of what I also dubbed our lost native orchids. So these are orchids that were once everywhere in the environment, as you'll soon see, all throughout the different habitats of South Florida, but have been largely extirpated, particularly from urban and developed areas. So there's three kind of pillars that the orchid program, the Million Orchid, stands on, which is very different. We've dubbed this a modern twist on conservation. So one of those pillars is, rather than focusing on the natural areas, which we do as well, we focus this program exclusively focus on public spaces, and particularly we're interested in urban settings and or areas where people live, work, and play. Also, rather than working with small groups of scientists hidden in the jungle somewhere, we enlist the help of the entire community, particularly student-aged children, and getting them involved in every aspect of the conservation strategy, as you'll soon see. And finally, the sheer number of 1 million orchids. We want it to be bold. We want it to be ambitious, because to be perfectly honest, these are kind of the big swings we're going to have to take to combat the loss of biodiversity and the loss of habitat, in which we're all seeing continue on throughout the world. So without further ado, I'll tell you a little about the program and hopefully intrigue some of you folks on how maybe we can integrate this program into the Florida Wildflower Foundation initiatives. So those that aren't familiar with Fairchild, we're down here in South Florida, all the way down near the tip in Coral Gables. We're an 83-acre botanic garden established in 1938, open to the public. And our namesake, Dr. David Fairchild, was a plant explorer, and he was responsible for bringing large numbers of plants to the New World, particularly parts of South America, Asia. He explored nearly every continent except for Antarctica. And so Fairchild historically was very famous for our palm collection. We have one of a world-class palm collection, as well as cycads, as well as tropical fruit trees. So we just had our mango festival last week, where we had 300 plus varieties of mango on display and for people to try. So we never really had a strong history with orchids until really the advent of the Million Orchid Project. And based on the enthusiasm from the public with the orchids, so we get a lot of times we'd be out doing orchid projects throughout the cities, and people are like, oh, wow, there's orchids in my neighborhood, but how come there's no orchids at Fairchild? So about 5 years ago, we really made an initiative also to bolster our orchid collections here at the Botanic Garden. And in the last 5 years, we've really gone kind of crazy and, again, highly experimental, trying to permanently install and establish orchids from around the world in our Botanic Garden. So we're really pushing the envelope on what species we can get away with growing them in a semi-natural context. To date, we've done nearly 35,000 orchids, which are either permanently attached or growing in the ground, like this Sobralia from South America here, Central and South America. Over 400 species and varieties, and at any given time, 25,000 plus to 100,000 in propagation in either our lab or nurseries. So it's quite an ambitious production, and as you'll find out, all driven by volunteers and students. We also have a lot of rarities at Fairchild you won't see anywhere else. So things like our ghost orchid, which blooms each year, draws a lot of attention, as well as rare orchids from the Caribbean, particularly Cuba, where for obvious reasons, the embargoes, a lot of this material hasn't made it out of that country. So being able to obtain species from Cuba is always a treat, and present them like the Browtonia lindenii there on the pink one on your right. So come check us out. You'll never know what you'll see. There'll always be something in bloom, but you know how Mother Nature works. Nothing blooms at the same time. And all of these beautiful displays of orchids growing in a very semi-natural context, you can see. But back to the Million Orchid Project, and we have to talk about the foundations and kind of where we're from and where we're headed. And really, we have to give credit for the inspiration of the program to National Orchid Garden in Singapore and the city of Singapore itself. So this is a world-class orchid garden at Singapore Botanic Garden called the National Orchid Garden. And we do a lot of work with out there, and we do a lot of collaborations with the folks out there, and we're really inspired by how forward thinking they are in terms of their greening and their landscapes and how they imagine a city within a garden, which we want to try to replicate in Miami. And long story short, we were out there probably about 15 years ago, and we wanted to check out their orchid laboratories, their micropropagation lab. It's how you grow orchids in large numbers, as we'll show some photos of that soon. And we noticed that, when you're there and you're looking at the lab, you're seeing all of these plants growing in flasks. And really, the numbers are just mind boggling. We're talking maybe thousands of plantlets in a single little flask. And one of the questions was, well, what do you do with all these orchids? It seems like you're propagating way more orchids than you need for the garden and or for commercial purposes. What are you doing with all these orchids? And to our surprise, they were actually handing some of these orchids off to their national parks service, who runs the entire island nation of Singapore in terms of the green spaces. And so we were out there and we were watching them plant these orchids with the bucket truck up in the trees, and ferns and bromeliads. And it was highly experimental at the time. And to our surprise, we come back a few years later, and it not only worked, but it transformed their landscapes. So if you go to Singapore, this is like what you're going to see. You're going to see bulbophyllums just growing up the side of the trees. Grammatophyllum speciosa, the largest orchid in the world, the queen of all orchids, or the tiger orchid, just growing along the side of the road. No big deal. To have even one of these blooming in the state of Florida is always like a big treat, and we have several here at the garden. But they're absolutely spectacular. They can be up nearly 3 to 4 meters in diameter when they're full grown and mature and live decades. But we were really inspired by that, so we automatically thought, why not Miami? Why not this urban metropolis? Why can't we reimagine ourselves as a city in a garden, starting with orchids, starting with a charismatic plant that could get people engaged and get people excited about urban greening and conservation? And we were once home to beautiful, charismatic native orchids, much like the grammatophyllums, our native cigar orchid, or Certipodium punctatum. This is a giant orchid, the largest orchid in North America. It can reach sizes up to 2 meters in diameter and hundreds of flowers, as you can see in this photo here. Things like our Encyclia tampensis, one of our most widespread orchids in South Florida. And this one also has a huge range as well. It gets all the way up to the Gainesville area and can tolerate some cool temperatures. But again, more common, but a great species, and one that is iconic to Florida, our Florida butterfly orchid. And Florida is really unique with orchids. And to put that into perspective, a little bit about Florida orchid diversity. There's approximately 200 species in all of North America. So not a large number, believe it or not. If you think of Cuba, it has about 350 species of orchid, and Mexico, nearly 1,200. So we don't have tremendous diversity, but here in Florida, it's definitely something special. About half of all those species are found here in Florida, about 100 in the state. And about a quarter, 60 or so, depending on who you ask, there's some debate, are in southern Florida, really within about 45-minute drive of Miami. So really what increases our diversity here in our state is the mix of temperate and tropical species, which coalesce here in Florida, usually around the Collier County area. So we have this unique blend of both temperate orchids, which you can find all the way to Canada, all the way to tropical orchids, which you'll find in Cuba, Central America, and South America. So South Florida is more or less, we've dubbed an orchid hotspot, and it's a great place to come see orchids. So you may ask yourself, what happened to all our orchids? Well, coupled with habitat loss and development, extreme poaching occurred. And so these are some archival photos from the early 1900s of wagon load after wagon load of orchids being pulled out of the trees. And basically, they've made their way on the Flagler Railroad almost immediately, shipped up to the northeast to the Victorian homes, and they were sold in the flower shops. They bloom on the table, and then they were pitched in the garbage after they were done flowering. What you're looking at here is our Mulier orchid, the one that has the dark leaf in the center of that wagon, and our cigar orchids, both of our state endangered. With the Mulier orchid, we work with the last 40 plants left in the Everglades. Certipodium, largest population, 100 plants. So these things are extremely imperiled in the state, but not so much anymore due to the help of students in the Million Orchid Project. So this kind of harvesting of orchids continued on for decades, right up until about the 1960s, and orchids are still being poached to the day out in the wild areas. And so wagon load after wagon load, bag after bag of these orchids were pulled out to where there were virtually none. They were all extirpated from the environment. This is even the lady in the white dress is David Fairchild's wife, which we always get a kick out of, with a big armful of epidendrums we dug out of the archives. So everyone was really in on the action, and it really made a huge dent into the population because the plants they were harvesting were the old mature adults, some of which could have been 50, 60, 70 years old. It's really hard to replace those genetics, and populations can crash really fast and dramatically. So to understand how we can grow a million orchids or how that's even possible, we have to just go very quickly into the biology of the seed. So these are not orchid seeds you're looking at here. This is the little bean seeds that we're all familiar with from elementary school, where the teacher sends you home with a lima beans and you put them in the wet paper towel, you put them in the drawer, and voila, they germinate and you get these little sprouts. Well, the reason they're able to do that is because of the anatomy of the seed. A typical seed has a organelle called the endosperm. And that endosperm is a food reserve, it's a starch reserve. So about 90% of a seed is really food for that little baby embryo. So this food helps them kickstart the germination, those first roots and those first leaves. Once they produce the leaves, they start to undergo photosynthesis and behave more or less like an autotroph, creating their own energy from sunlight. In the case of the coconut here, it's like the perfect package, right? It even has water, so it can wash right up on the shore and readily germinate. We like to say their mom packed them a lunch to the little ones. Well, orchid seeds are the complete opposite end of the spectrum, where they're the smallest amongst the smallest of any plant. They're often called dust seeds. They're microscopic. Here's some images on the microscope of some of our orchid seeds. They lack the endosperm it was a trade-off in order to become really minute in size and be able to disperse great distances. So it's not uncommon for orchids to cross oceans, orchid seeds that blow in the trade winds across oceans. Here in South Florida, we actually share a couple of orchids with West Africa. Those seeds blow all the way across in the trade winds or in the Saharan dust and make their way to the US and germinate. But what you can see here with these orchid seeds is that it's a very simple seed type. That dark structure in the center is the embryo, the little baby plant. And essentially it's in an air case, a little hot air balloon that's designed to blow on the wind. And the seed coat's made of a very thin, clear layer, almost like a glass casing that protects the embryo from drying out. And they come in all shapes and sizes, just like the flowers of an orchid. So a single capsule of an orchid, as you can see here, this is the fruit or capsule, if you will, can contain millions, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of tiny seeds. I'm sorry for the resolution on that one. But a capsule, for instance, like our cigar orchid, can contain nearly 4 million seeds in a single pod. And so the sheer number of seeds really allows it to grow large numbers of orchids. Well, another really fun factoid about orchids, the family Orchidaceae, is arguably the largest plant family in the world. Roughly 1 in every 9 plants on the planet is an orchid, believe it or not. And they're found everywhere on the planet except the Sahara Desert and Antarctica. So there's even orchids in Siberia. People don't realize they're ground orchids, but there's orchids nevertheless. So pretty much anywhere the human is living, there's going to be an orchid species right there. And so Darwin himself kind of struggled with that. He said, well, if there's more orchids than any other plant, and they all produce millions, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of seeds, why isn't the earth just blanketed in orchids? Well, what Darwin didn't know at the time is that orchids, because they have no food reserve and their moms didn't pack them a lunch, they have to find food in the environment. And so what do these seeds use to germinate? And what they use is actually a bizarre relationship and association with fungus. So orchids, what you'll see in these pictures are germinated orchid seeds, which have taken up the fungus. You can see the fungal hyphae entering into the seed, and it swells up and begins to grow into this little protocorm-like body, essentially like a stem cell. After the leaf litter kind of separates a bit, you'll see sunlight or light begins to make contact with the little growing seedling, and then it begins to produce the photosynthetic pigments, and soon after it will produce the roots and leaves. So that's the reason why the earth isn't blanketed in orchids, because you can imagine, what are the chances you're a speck of dust, you blow across an ocean, you land in just the right tree on a mushroom, or in just the right soil type on a fungus? Exceedingly rare. So out of maybe 4 million seeds, only luckily maybe 1% will germinate typically in the wild. And that's not uncommon. Again, the strategy of producing so many seeds that even 1% of 4 million is still a decent number of orchids germinating each year. But also kind of all considering this interaction with fungus, this was the big reason why back in the 1930s, people would sprinkle these orchid seeds of their favorite orchid out of their greenhouse into pots or onto soil or onto coconut husks, and nothing would ever happen. They couldn't figure it out because they didn't understand this relationship with the fungi. So around the 1950s, the big breakthrough was the advent of the nutrient agar media. So essentially, this black layer that's on the bottom of these little seedlings is a nutrient-rich agar-based media. So it's kind of like a semi-solid, like a gelatin-like substance. The black color is from activated carbon, which is used to take up impurities or byproducts of the plants when they're growing. And really, the main component constituent that the plants are using is sugar. So rather than making sugar on their own via photosynthesis, they're actually taking sugar in directly from the roots. They're actually mainlining the sugar. And when you use these lab techniques, you can germinate nearly 100% of the seeds, as you can see here. So when we built our orchid lab, we didn't want to just manage with a bunch of us scientists kind of hidden in a silo doing our work. We actually began our orchid lab with all volunteers, many of which are still with us now 15 years later. Some of them are in their 90s and still chugging away growing orchids in the greenhouse or the lab. And it was all women at that time, which was also kind of neat. And some of them even had science backgrounds, but kind of gave it up in the 70s and 80s to raise families. And so they were coming back in their golden years and reimagining, reinvigorating their scientific life. And really, it took off. And it was highly experimental. We enlisted the help of that gentleman there, Dr. Martin Moats, one of the premier orchid breeders in the world. And what's great about Martin is he kind of has DIY or DIY methods to growing orchids. So rather than using pipettes and all these fancy instruments, we use ladles and things that people are comfortable using that you might find in a kitchen. And it was highly experimental, but sure enough, it really worked. And these ladies really, within a matter of months, transformed our lab into orchid production hotspot. And you can see here hundreds upon hundreds of flasks, each containing hundreds, if not thousands, of little plantlets growing pretty much within the first 6 months of the program. So it wasn't, can we grow orchid? It's what the heck do we do with all the orchids? It became a square footage issue. It became an issue of capacity. And soon after, this was our situation at the greenhouse, and layers and layers of orchids, again, all being managed as endless flood by volunteers that do a tremendous job learning how to grow plants and grow not just any plants, some of the rarest plants in North America. And so it still continued to grow. Each year we added on some new species. So right now, currently we work with really primarily 5 species for the reintroduction program. So these are species that were hand selected because we thought they would perform well in urban. Oh, that was weird. Thought they would perform well in urban environments. So things that came either from dry systems, dry habitats, or things that we thought could tolerate these urban heat island effects, which we'll talk a little about. And of course, we had some cool ones, charismatic ones like our mascot, the ghost orchid Dendrophylax lindenii, and Vanilla deloniana, which is a vine only recorded once on the Miami River. So we throw in some oddballs there, which we're also having a lot of fun with. But our core 8 plants are really what we're focusing on for the reintroductions in the landscapes. And there's both epiphytic orchids, so orchids that grow on trees, as well as ground orchids or terrestrial orchids like the Bledia purpurea and our little Oncidium insanum, our native dancing lady. So again, we immediately had to get the schools involved in this program to become extensions of our laboratory and help us increase our capacity. So in the first year, we had nearly 105 schools, all spread throughout South Florida and a little bit beyond, all basically becoming extensions of our lab. So we provided them with all of the grow rack systems, everything they needed to grow the orchids. But not only grow the orchids, but conduct research alongside that. When we started the program, there were no protocols, species-specific protocols for our native orchids. We kind of had to use generic recipes. So through the work of these students, we now have defined species-specific protocols for all of our orchids. And so they'll grow them in their little tubs. Often they're different colors for different media supplements or treatments. And that one's good, that one's bad, that kid there. And then they'll track the growth rates, and then they'll help us influence and improve our protocols and that we can publish and share with the broader community. So after a certain stage, about a few months in the flasks, the students will then take them out of their little bubble baby environments, and they plant them in these little greenhouse domes and put them back on their growth racks until the wet season, when they'll plant them out in their communities. To put in perspective, what you're looking at here is our cowhorn orchid, our Certipodium punctatum, or the cigar orchid I called earlier, that big giant. Again, we're down to about 100 plants left in Fakahatchee, our largest population. And you can see here at this one school, you have dozens in each of these greenhouse domes. So that's conservation really happening. You extrapolate that over 100 schools. That's conservation really happening at a scale we had never seen before. And the fate of these orchids is always back in starting in their schoolyards. As you can see here, planting the Bleedia purpureas in the ground at Jose Marti Mass with Andy Kearns. We mentioned him earlier. And in their trees and all throughout their communities. And we have a lot of fun with it. And students are now really taking on bigger and broader projects. They're actually growing orchids of cultural significance. So this is, again, our school, Jose Marti Mast in Hialeah, and they're really interested in growing Cuban orchids because it's the home of the largest Cuban population in the U.S. So we can tweak the educational model, which is really successful for really to fit any area and region, and everyone has an orchid. So you can always do the program anywhere in the world. And some schools have taken it to another level, like our biotech high school, which has a lab even bigger than ours. They have 2 laminar flow hoods. The sterile workspace is needed to do this work, and they can produce tens of thousands of orchids just at this one school alone, which we can share with everyone around the counties. And collecting seeds now and hand pollinating. So bulking seeds is something that's really important in seed banking for future generations. So all these conservation methods, as the program grows, students can get involved in. So really what we're talking about also here is how the program has also spurred innovation and how we're really creating new natural experiments, new basically trajectories and new levels and elements to this program. And one of the first things we had to kind of overcome is the laboratory component. As you can imagine, very few schools in Miami-Dade have a big, beautiful orchid laboratory like biotech. So we had to find a way to bring the lab to them. And that's, again, when we enlisted the help of more students, this time at the University of Miami, their architecture school. And these senior architecture students took what we joke as the least sterile thing on the planet, a decommissioned school bus, and turned it into a fully operational micropropagation laboratory. And I'll kind of just fast forward to the end. And this is what it looks like now, our STEM lab. And this program visits 70 schools a year, and we can generate nearly 20,000 orchids a year just with 6th and 7th graders alone. And it's a lot of fun. I have an amazing team of educational staff which runs this programming, and they grow the orchids, and they get to learn all about the conservation and of plants, particularly of orchids, even some of the invasive ones, as you can see here, and seed biology and all that fun stuff that we can do the educational programming around it. It gets a lot of attention. It's been featured like in Scholastic and a bunch of other national news media because it's really one of a kind. And this, again, this idea of getting young people involved to really do real things. One thing about the Million Orchid Project and everything we do at Fairchild is it has to be authentic. It has to be real. We don't want to give them the bean plants where they pour different concoctions on them. We want to really put real life problems in the hands of young people. And that was really controversial when we started the program. Some of my dear friends, which have turned around quite a bit now and actually mimicking our program, were very skeptical about putting young people in charge of things that are rare and precious. But that was of the utmost importance to us here at Fairchild. And really the crux of this whole program is to inspire young people to think about plants, to think about conservation. And we do all types of other ways to get the lab around. We have these little portable air cleans, which we can take all around the state. Unfortunately, our STEM lab is restricted to Miami-Dade County because we share that vehicle with the county. We have a little shade house, which, again, the School of Architecture took on and created a little prototype. The next step is to have every school in Miami-Dade with a shade house and a lab. So we're always trying to find ways to bring the technology to students to basically, reverse engineer things that are complex, make them simple, and get them out to the students where they can really take part in every component of the plant conservation. Excuse me. And they do everything. Like I mentioned, this is real science. One of the first things we had to think about when we did that, and my colleagues were right for mentioning it, say, hey, Jason, if you're going to put a million orchids out in the environment, what are the genetics of your plants? And I was happy to say, not only do we know the genetics of our plants, but again, we did it with high school students. And it was in a peer-reviewed publication where students developed novel microsatellites to do all the population genetic studies of 2 of our most important species. And this had 15 high school co-authors, and I can't even get my grad students to get their papers out. So it's always a testament of what students are capable of, even at young ages, if they have the exposure and the resources and the guidance to do so. And each year we continue on our publications with students, everything from in vitro propagation of different orchid species all the way to seed banking methods, that can be applied to orchids all around the world. So this is real science, it's real conservation, and it's a lot of fun too. And again, this is now kind of grown well beyond our geographic range here in South Florida. We now have labs at every major university here in South Florida. Miami-Dade, pretty much all of their campuses have an orchid lab. Broward County is doing orchids. Florida Atlantic University, Pine Jog was one of our partners in West Palm Beach, and of course our high school biotech. And even beyond the state of Florida, we've had a grant with the Smithsonian and the North American Orchid Society for the last 4 years, where we're growing orchids in the classroom all the way up there in Maryland, inserting their local native orchid into our educational programming. And it's a lot of fun, even though the little temperate terrestrial orchids grow very slow compared to our tropical orchids down here. So it's kind of watching like paint dry, but nevertheless, the same concepts applies. And this model is now being exported around the world. We're in 3 Caribbean nations: Jamaica, DR, Cayman Islands soon, Grenada is on the way, all using this educational model to insert their local native orchid, as well as Kerala, India with Kew Gardens, and soon to be London, UK with their 1,000 Meadow project, which we'll talk a little bit about too. So it's just not the schools that play a pivotal role. Obviously, all the communities and the public partners are a big reason why we can put 1 million orchids back out into the landscapes. So I'm happy to say this is not even close to a complete list. So forgive me if you recognize one of if you participate and you're not on here. This is all I could fit on one slide, but we're now up to nearly 100 public and private partners. Every major city in Miami more or less has a long-term contract with us, phase plan. Some are multiple years, where they're putting tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of orchids all throughout their communities, street trees, hospitals. Every major hospital now, all the Baptist, all the Jackson hospitals have orchids. As I mentioned, the universities, retirement communities are some of our best partners. Broward Native Orchids does a great job, and Rich Ackerman up there in Broward for us. Orchid societies, cruise lines, you name it, everyone's getting in on the action. And that's how we're going to basically blanket this whole landscape with orchids and transform things. And just like we do with the kids, we have big community events where we enlist help of the community to get these orchids back out into the wild, or the urban wild, if you will, which is even more dynamic. And we do this in a number of ways, whether it's community gatherings. I love this photo because the gentleman with the Florida Gator stuff on, even though we're hurricanes down here, we'll forgive him, is actually the great grandson of John Lummis. And those may recognize the name Lummis, as in Lummis Park on Miami Beach, and the Fisher and the Fishers. So Lummis and the Fishers were some of the early pioneers of South Florida, and were largely responsible for developing and and clearing a lot of the habitat, which is now modern day Miami, when they first acquired the lands, particularly Miami Beach. And so his great grandson found out about the program, and they have a foundation, and they wanted to commit some funds to repatriating some of these orchids back into the parks, the very areas which his predecessors basically developed. And his kids come down every summer. They're from up in Arkansas, and they come all the way down to Miami every summer and do plantings with us on Miami Beach, and it's a lot of fun. And my kids get involved, and we all out there planting orchids. And we have distributions at some of the communities. This is in Coral Gables, where we give homeowners, if they come with their ID, they can get a native orchid for their backyard conservation happening. Of course, all the dignitaries want to get involved as well, get their photo ops. This is the mayor of Coral Gables a few years back. And what's funny is this was like the first orchid that was stolen was the one he planted. It was like gone within 24 hours. We shouldn't have put it on TV. But we'll talk a little bit about losses and how we deal with that, and how we don't worry so much about that with the nature of the program. And we're out there attaching the orchids to all these suitable, beautiful hardwoods throughout the landscapes. And even in the medians of roads. So this is the Wells Fargo's green team out in the middle of US 1 in downtown Miami, planting ground orchids in the medians. And they're doing really well. And they're doing great. Urban Miami-Dade. So this is actually the design district. And you can see right in front of all places, the Gucci building. You now have native Tampensis and cigar orchids growing all along the trees. And it's absolutely spectacular, as you can imagine. There's our cigar orchids. Who'd have thunk a cigar orchid growing in downtown Miami? People pay money to go see this out in the Fakahatchee and the Everglades, and you can just go right downtown and now see them. Trichocentrum undulatum, our Mulier orchid. This one's a little beat up, but it was so massive I had to take a photo of it. We're down to 40 plants of this left, and you can now find these throughout schoolyards in Miami. Epidendrum nocturnum now blooming for the first time this year. We're excited to see that one, and you can see how well they're really doing. So we're learning a lot about how resilient these plants are. It was thought that orchids are really sensitive to disturbance and sensitive to changes in these very specific microclimate and habitat conditions, but we're finding that they're quite more flexible and resilient than we had ever thought, which is very, very, very encouraging and optimistic, because if an orchid can survive in a urban environment, in a schoolyard, which is pretty rough place to live, then a lot of other plants and trees should be able to handle it and tolerate it as well. And we now have flowering orchids after the last 3 years across all of Miami-Dade County. Here's our ground on Oncidium and Sedum growing at the pool at the Biltmore Hotel of all places. Again, some of the rarest plants you'll ever see in North America. And we're really happy to see the orchids are flowering. So we kind of check that off, that we can establish these plants from the lab into the urban environment and they'll flower. It's kind of like stage step 1, check. But the next thing was, are the pollinators even around for these things? Are they being pollinated? And you'll see this is a Miracle Mile down in downtown Coral Gables recently. They're absolutely looking amazing. And sure enough, the last 2 or 3 years, we've been getting photos back from our schools and we're finding pollinators visiting our orchids. So that was very, very, very optimistic and encouraging. So we know pollinators are still out there in these urban environments that are capable of pollinating orchids. So the next big question is fruit set. And sure enough, recently, you'll see here in the circle, we've been producing fruit capsules on many of our encyclia in particular. And we're really, again, encouraged to see that next step taking fold. But again, there's another big limitation, as we talked about early on, and that's the fungus. So the next big kind of ecological question was, is the fungus available in the urban environment? Or are these fungus restricted to the natural areas where the climate and the conditions are more historically consistent? And sure enough, the last 2 years, we've been finding volunteers. And this little tiny batch of little baby orchids don't look like much, but I was telling you, I was screaming in the street when I found these because this was kind of like the final piece of the puzzle, completing the circle of life for an orchid and demonstrating that it can take place in a less than natural environment. And we're now finding the little babies popping up everywhere. So another kind of component of this, kind of now that we're seeing reproduction, we're seeing volunteers and recruits popping up, is tracking the orchids. Again, we wanted the community involved and also students to lead the way. This was our app, the Million Orchid Project app, which is currently undergoing its beta version right now. So it's not currently available. We hope to have that up and running by the school year. And basically what this app does is you can download it on your phone and it'll pop up all of the orchids in your area. So you can kind of see the distribution map here in Miami-Dade of some orchid. And then you can go to one of those pins on the map. And then once you get there, it'll pop up all the different orchids in that plot or that location. And then you'll go and you'll find a little QR tag. It'll direct you there with your phone. And then you zap the little QR and you become the citizen scientist. It asks you, does it have flowers? Is it dead? Is it alive? Has it been stolen? Do you see fruit capsules? And depending on how sophisticated you are, you can get all the way down to the number of stems, the number of roots attached, and all of that really neat stuff to help us track long-term the demographic changes in these populations that we're establishing and the success we're seeing. So all of these kind of innovations are constantly popping up organically. And so we're constantly growing opportunities for new natural experiments. So you can see these oncidiums growing in raised beds, which we're finding are great little kind of reproductive populations we can set up at schools, which are a little more protected from the lawnmower guys over the summer. And so we're letting students kind of drive this. And one of the big questions we've been looking at more recently is this concept of the heat island effect. And just a little example this year, students, you can see the heat island effect is essentially the hypothesis and the theory that the concrete jungle essentially will trap heat which makes the temperatures typically on average higher than the surrounding rural and suburban and natural areas, as well as less precipitation. And so the farther you get from that urban core, that urban center, the more the cooler and the more precipitation you tend to find. And that definitely seems to be the case here in South Florida. And so those of you that are joining, I'm sure you're familiar with the Florida Plant Hardiness Zone Map. And you can see a few years ago, we were elevated to 11A and 10B here in South Florida, and 11B in Key West. And 10A is now shifted up kind of towards southwest, and 9B and 9A, the whole state got bumped up. So it was kind of appropriate for us to start looking at this to see how are plants going to respond to climate change, to this warming trend we're seeing and all feeling. And it's pretty extreme. I won't bore you guys with too many of these graphs, but you can see here, when I moved back in 99, you could see the average number of days over 95 were less than 15 per year. Currently, I think we had nearly 50 days last year in Miami-Dade, roughly 50 days last year, but we're expected over the next 20 to 30 years to see that rise to over 75 days over 95. So this is really dramatic. It's happening at a pace we think that plants may not be able to keep up with. And so one way we can understand more about that is doing experiments. And one thing we do here in South Florida, which makes us unique, again, kind of an orchid hotspot, is that we're actually part of the Caribbean floristic region. So we have more in common in terms of our plants with Bahamas and Cubas than we do with the Panhandle or Orlando. So we have an opportunity to kind of set up some natural experiments. And also our climate is very unique. So you can see the majority of the peninsula is in the temperate or humid subtropical and or temperate if you get up in the Panhandle. But you look down in the South Florida, you have things that are even classified as rainforest, tropical monsoon, and tropical savanna in the greater Everglades. So really thinking about how these climate changes may impact the types of plants we can get away with growing. So we decided this year to do something kind of experimental and test out some of our Caribbean orchids that we grow at Fairchild alongside the native orchid, their native cousins, and things like the guarianthe, Myrmecophila, and Browtonia from the Bahamas and Cuba, Brassivola, which is found all throughout the Caribbean, and seeing how if they are more resilient because they're from these historic plant hardiness zones than our native orchids, or our native orchids adapting just as well as the Caribbean orchids. And really quick, you'll see, sure enough, this year we did have higher survivorship from our Caribbean species, Brassivola, Humboldtii, and Sanguinea, than we did some of our native orchids, which is roughly around 40 to 50% survivorship. That's pretty typical for us because particularly in the schools, we see a lot of losses due to things that aren't in the control of the student, like the weed whacker guy, as I mentioned, in the summer, or the seniors that are being jerks and they pull the orchids off the trees. You name it, you'll kind of see it at a school. But again, 40%, when they're growing hundreds is actually a huge number in terms of pressure and what we can do in terms of restoration. But again, how do we fit into kind of what you guys are doing at the Florida Wildflower Foundation? And that's something I've been thinking about now for a few years, and that's direct seed sowing. So again, this role with the mycorrhizal fungi made traditional sowing of orchid seeds really unheard of because a lot of the scientific literature says many of these orchids are very specialized. The fungi they use may only be in very specific habitats. But again, we're finding that that's not always the case. There's actually some orchids that are quite generalist and can germinate on a number of different fungi. So the Johnny Appleseed method is something I'm becoming more and more interested in, and getting orchid seeds directly sowed into the environment and tracking them. And we have done this successfully. You can see here I sprinkled some of the cowhorn orchids, the cigar orchid seeds, on this branch that was kind of rotting, which I knew it had some of the same fungal groups in there. And sure enough, a bunch of seedlings emerged, and we were able to germinate seeds through direct sowing. And so kind of thinking more about this and potentially working with the Wildflower Foundation, I dug around to see if anyone had ever tried this before. So I'm searching for, you guys probably all familiar with these wildflower seed mixes. And sure enough, not a single one had an orchid seed in it. And maybe it's because they're small, or maybe it's because, they thought they may not perform well due to the that fungal requirement. But it really opened my eyes to why not? Why don't we try this, particularly if we can generate lots of seeds through seed bulking? And it's also being done in other places. So more recently, we've teamed up with the Essex Wildflower or Wildlife Trust and their Thousand Meadow project in UK, and they reached out to us as part of our conservation group where we work with the Chelsea Flower Show. And so I got to meet the folks at Essex Wildflower Trust, and they were interested in kicking off this Thousand Meadow project. So they've had a real big issue with meadow loss in UK. I think it's 97% have been lost since the 1930s. So there's very few of these meadows, pristine meadows left. They were all converted into agricultural lands, as you might expect. So they're basically mitigating these lands and converting them into wildflowers. And one of the things they want to introduce is the community component. So not just working with orchids, which they are, but also getting the community involved, like we do with the Million Orchid Project, to make their impacts bigger and scale up their efforts. And sure enough, this is some photos from them out there planting some of these orchid seeds and other wildflowers, and converting these previous agricultural lands or nutrient or areas where they were degraded, and working with orchids as well. And they target a handful of their beautiful ground orchids out there to do this type of work, including direct seed sowing. Also in the U.S., right here in the U.S., a lot of this work is being done. Thinking about roadsides, thinking about these kind of disturbed habitats that people thought didn't have much value. Well, our colleagues up in Jacksonville and Georgia, there's Houston out there, they were finding that some of these ground orchids, things like Planthera chapmanii, sorry, did really well in these kind of roadside mowed areas. So a lot of these ground orchids, particularly ones from grasslands and meadows, really prefer disturbance. Historically, grasslands and things like that will either burn or they'll have some type of disturbance periodically, which kind of knocks back the competition and allows orchids to take hold. And once they found is that through the mowing programs and the proper land management, that they were recovering some of the rarest orchid populations by mowing and having the right land management on these roadsides. And so this has really had me thinking about Florida in bigger ways, and why not trying that there? Because of course we have all of our beautiful grassland orchids, like our calopogon here on the side of the roads, where you'll find them. Like where you find these orchids is actually on the sides of roads where they're mowed, where these areas are mowed and they're managed. Or there's wildflowers there and they're able to repopulate with the right native vegetation. Things like Sequoia lanceolata. This population I stumbled upon driving up through Yeehaw Junction on the Florida Turnpike. And of course, I had my son jump out with the ruler, gave my wife a heart attack as we dart across the highway to go out and collect some samples, some measurements and things like on this population of the red lady tress orchid. Absolutely stunning little orchid, and grows right along the roadside, and a beautiful addition to any wildflower community. So there's a few species which I've kind of had up my sleeve, which I think again will perform well in these reestablishing these wildflower areas. Things like, again, like our Sequoia lanceolata, the red lady tress, the calopogon, and most importantly, one called Bleedia purpurea, which is one we've grown for many years now and have a lot of success with. This orchid, you can see, has a wide variety of habitat tolerances. I found this thing growing on floating logs, like on the picture on the left, all the way to dry pine rocklands and grasslands. So it's a very versatile orchid. It has a very broad range. It gets all the way up into central Florida and expanding its range northward, and would be a great candidate to think about seed bulking and putting into seed mixes. So we've been bulking these seeds now for a number of years, working with the schools. They send us a subset of their seeds. And in this little vial here is a 5 milliliter vial. And inside there are about 10 million seeds. And you extrapolate that, I have about 10 tubes or less. That's about 100 million seeds, which are basically bulked, banked, and ready to be Johnny Appleseed throughout the appropriate regions in Florida. And so this is something we're really interested in driving this next layer of research in the Million Orchid Project. Things like, will these seeds germinate on their own, particularly in these wildflower communities? And then if they do, we can go out and sample the mycorrhizal fungi, use DNA techniques, and find out what fungus they're using and how this fungus helps and interacts with the other plants in that area? And also, how does landscape management affect orchid persistence? Um, do these orchids prefer regions that may be mowed periodically or that may periodically burn versus ones which are able to have just a normal succession, potentially with suppression of any type of management? So these are all things that we can layer into the research, again, getting the community involved. So just to wrap up, the Million Orchid Project started in 2013. To date, we have nearly 700,000 orchids. Sorry, I need to update that. Nearly 350 locations, 50,000 students plus. Each year we add on students, each year we add on partners, each year we add on species. And so even though the major hiccup of COVID, Hurricane Irma, all of these obstacles, we continue to press on and hopefully achieve the goal of 1 million orchids and beyond, as long as we have the enthusiasm of folks like the Florida Wildflower Foundation and the community at large. So with that, thank you guys for hearing a little bit more about the program. We hope to I'm happy to answer a few questions. Here's our contact information, the Million Orchid Project at fairchildgarden.org. You can also zap the QR tag. And if you live here in South Florida, you can actually purchase orchids for your backyard to support the program and do a little backyard conservation. And with that, thank you for your time. And I'm happy to take a few questions if we have the time.
That was fantastic and inspiring. Thank you so much, Jason. We do have some really great questions in the chat, so we'll start with a few, in the Q&A feature. So if you do have additional questions, please enter them there as we get started. The first question has to do with the propagation, and you showed the medium that you were propagating in. So are you also propagating the fungi and incorporating it into that medium?
Yes, so we do that as well, and that's kind of a different layer of research. That's a whole different ball of wax. It's a lot more technical to grow with the fungus because there's a lot more moving parts involved. The fungus has to be sterile, the seeds have to be sterile, they have to be merged together sterilely. So to grow with the fungus is a lot more difficult. But there are some orchids that will only grow with the symbiotic fungi. A lot, particularly some of the temperate orchids that we work with.
So the species
So some,
you're
yep.
doing without the fungi.
We're doing mostly asymbiotic without the fungus, but in our research capacity, we bank fungi as well as grow symbiotically as well.
Okay, great, thank you. A few questions just about environmental challenges, and I'm going to lump these two together. Are you having any issues with iguana predation, and also how do hurricane rains and winds impact your survival rates?
So yes, iguanas are the bane of my existence, and they drive me nuts. They can mow down whole displays in one day. So we do see predation to iguanas, and as a result, we try to avoid areas near water. That's typically where iguanas like to hang out, is near ponds, canals. So we've learned to avoid sites with lots of ponds or trees near ponds and canals where they like to roost. Also, when you put the orchid just kind of on the underside or on the side of the branch, not on the top, they're less likely to forage on the plant, which we found. Hurricanes is definitely something we're looking at. Salt tolerance, particularly with saltwater inundation and salt spray, are something we're looking at. Two of our orchid species grow in the mangrove, so those I predict will do fine with storms, periodic storms. But there are species which do not tolerate, like our little ground orchids, which do not tolerate salt spray. And so hurricanes could be an issue. But hurricanes will not blow the orchids off the trees. They do not pull them off. They're adapted to the subtropics and the tropics. So there's hurricanes they've dealt with for eons. The only time we lose them is when the whole tree comes down.
Great. This one's kind of specific, but it does bring up an interesting issue. And I'm going to try to pronounce these genuses right. Does Cryptopodium and Oncidium genuses, and does planting those two in dense qualities have a risk of hybridization, or are they different enough that that risk is minimal?
So the Oncididae and those are our native Certipodium and our native Oncidium. They probably would. I don't think they would hybridize those two together. I think they're too distantly related, and I think there's a chromosome difference. I'm pretty sure there's a chromosome difference, but they're potentially, in a very rare chance, a cultivated plant could hybridize with a native plant. But one thing that we do find here with our subtropical species is that the phenologies are different. Our native cowhorn, our Certipodium, and Oncidium flower at different times than the non-native ones. So the chances of that pollen transfer happening is unlikely.
That's good. Let's see. So you kind of touched on this when we talked about the hardiness. Someone did ask specifically about growing orchids on the beach side with the impacts of salt spray. So you have to be species selective with that.
Yes, and what you're going to want to target, which we do offer, are the Caribbean species.
Mm,
So things like those Caribbean species, they grow right on the rocky coastlines on the islands in Cuba, Jamaica, the Bahamas. So they are built for all of that salt spray. And I mean, when I say they grow on the beach, like a palm, coconut palm on the beach with a giant cowhorn or browtonia on that. So those are the ones you're going to want to target are Caribbean orchids if you live on a beach.
okay. And then can you speak briefly to conditions for seed storing?
Yep. So we make the orchid seeds in a number of ways. You can see we usually typically will dry the seeds. So the seeds have to be removed from the capsule, allowed to dry. One thing when you're ever storing seeds is the capsules is to allow them to dry in paper bag. Don't seal them up in plastic or a plastic container or a Ziploc, they'll rot. So if you allow them to air dry down, the seed capsule will naturally split open. The seeds will shake out. And those are dry seeds, which then can be banked at 4 degrees. Of course, we do have a bunch of experiments with -80 liquid nitrogen. But what's really interesting is we're finding that orchid seeds are quite recalcitrant. They're resilient, and that we're finding that viability can be maintained for up to 10 years. We're germinating things that are 10 years old at room temperature. So that's something we weren't expecting with such a small seed. But
Yeah.
but the dry seed type, no endosperm, there's not a lot of water in these seeds, so they can really they bank quite well.
Great. Um, One more question about the program, and then the remaining questions really are about kind of your partners. But is anyone looking at the social science side of working with these students, or kind of following the students in the program to see where they go from there?
Yeah, so we do that. We're trying to become more systematic at that. All of our programs, we also have a big program at NASA. The education department here does tracking on those. There has been a few studies where they've tracked some students on. Really anecdotally, I know because my students just keep coming back. My lab right now is full of my high school students that have been with me since 8th grade that are now in college or out of medical school, and they come back every summer and are still doing orchid research. And I mean, when I say a lot, I mean we've probably had over 150 undergraduates and high school students work outside of their school in our labs over the last 15 years, and many of which kind of stick with biology and have moved on to careers in environmental sciences or biology,
That's
and a lot
fantastic.
with plants, which is great.
Yeah, I mean, really spreading that love of plants with that age group is so wonderful. And I was so impressed with having, those published papers with student authors. That's amazing.
Yeah.
Um, so then kind of the remainder of our questions are around the other groups that you work with. Are there any other kind of locations in Florida you're working? How can orchid societies get involved? Are you working with interfaith communities? Um, and just that kind of beyond South Florida outlook.
Yes, absolutely. So our footprint is stretching all the way up the Panhandle, and like I said, in other states. If you're interested in bringing it to your community, I see a bunch of counties up here and cities which we definitely work in the Keys. For instance, we're doing some of them all over Broward, of course, Brevard, as you know, Brevard Zoo. But yes, if you're interested in the program, I will type in the contact. You can either reach out to the Million Orchid Project email, or you can reach out directly to, I'm going to type in my program manager's email, and we can sit down and explore options and how to get your community involved. And really, we work with anyone. So it's aluna@fairchildgarden.org. If you can share that with the group, or if someone can jot that down, you can shoot us an email, and we're happy to work with everyone. I mean, no budget's too little, no budget's too big for what we're doing, and we find ways that are appropriate for your resources to get you guys involved. And yes, we do work with the communities of faith, a couple churches, or our Presbyterian church here has got an amazing collection. And so, yeah, anyone's welcome, and we'll find a way to get you involved.
Fantastic. Well, we are right at time, and great questions, everybody. And I just thank you again so much for sharing this work. And we'll be sure to include that email address and that information in the resources that will get emailed out to everyone who
Thank
participated
you.
today. So I hope everybody has a great rest of their week and afternoon. And thanks for joining us today.
All right. Bye bye.